Hello, this is Georgina Rose, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, esotericism, and everything on the fringes of religion. And I'm your host, Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aether. And in this video, we're going to be going on a rant because I am pissed. I am so mad at the misinformation going around the internet regarding the divine feminine. So, to begin, I really do incorporate the divine feminine into my metaphysical practice. For those who don't know me, I am a pagan, I am a perennialist, and I worship a goddess, right? But online, the divine feminine has become something entirely different, entirely divorced from metaphysics, and has been used to promote toxic materialist ideologies that I take huge issue with as a person who actually honors the metaphysics of the divine feminine in its traditional form and sees it how it is meant to be seen. So I think we should talk about why has the divine feminine blown up on the internet, and then what the divine feminine actually is, and debunk all the misinformation that you might be seeing about the divine feminine on social media. So first, what is going on? So basically, the internet is really into spirituality and has been for a while. There was a big boom right around 2020 where a community called Witch Talk really blew up. And this brought a lot of occult and witchy and pagan ideas and ideologies into the mainstream. Now that has kind of died down, and I think that really happened with the end of the coronavirus and the end of all those lockdowns. A lot of people went back into the real world, and when you go back into the real world, you have to socialize and interact with other people. Or at least I hope you do that. Please be social and have a normal social life. But for women, which was the majority of people involved in the Witch Talk movement, that involves interacting with men and dating. And so I think that reintegration with society and nude interest in dating and love is why the divine feminine blew up. Because the divine feminine is a spiritual idea, but you can easily apply it to lifestyle ideas such as sex, dating, love, and that's where a lot of this conversation is going to go. So what on earth is the divine feminine? What actually is it? So the divine feminine is a metaphysical principle, right? So there's this idea that is the root of all metaphysics, and if you've listened to my channel, you've heard this a million times, and that is the macrocosm and the microcosm. And this law of understanding is the basis of all metaphysics. It's simple, but it has such vast metaphysical implications that I think it's really important to discuss it and bring it up. So we live within the microcosm, which is the small universe, right? You and I, we exist in this small space. And beyond us, there is so much more. There are gods, there are angels, there are demons, there are jinn. There is a whole world beyond this world. And that is the macrocosm, right? Everything beyond us. And the macrocosm and the microcosm reflect each other. We were created by the gods, and we engage in acts of creation when we have children. We have things change in our lives as the planets move, causing the change in our lives. And when we do magical ritual or engage in metaphysical practice, we are using the microcosm in order to impact the macrocosm, right? We're kind of doing that in reverse. And so the divine feminine exists in our personal lives, right? If you're a woman, you are intrinsically linked to the divine feminine. But the divine feminine obviously exists beyond us and in a metaphysical context. And so if we think about the universe, we always understand that there's this microcosm and macrocosm, which implies a chain of being and a chain of creation and a metaphysical hierarchy, right? We are on the material plane. We are the bottom of the metaphysical hierarchy, right? We're the earth. We're way, way at the bottom, but there's so much beyond us. And if we look at the highest level of metaphysical reality, right? This is going to get a little abstract. We have to think about these two principles, right? So everything begins starting at a source, at a oneness, and this is the Godhead, right? This is where I'm a polytheist. All the gods kind of come together and meet, right? And from this point, things break apart. And the first break apart is into severity and mercy, right? Into these two columns, right? And in these two columns, we have action and reaction, creation, destruction, mercy, severity, active, receiving, right? So things push outwards. But once something is pushed outwards, that's an energetic creation, right? There's an energy, there's a push, there's an existence, right? There's something coming from this direction, right? And that is endless growth, endless expansion. Now, for that to exist and make a universe, right? We understand that things need to expand, but for things to expand, they need to be shaped. They need to be formed. They need to be brought into something that can exist, right? Because if we think about endless things like coming out, right? Like, let's think about like a waterfall, right? So we have a waterfall, right? There's water falling down the waterfall. The waterfall must land in a river or else it will flood the world and nothing will make sense, right? And so this receptive pillar is the river, right? And that is the divine feminine. The divine masculine is endless expansion and the divine feminine is endless shaping and restriction, and is what gives things form and allow it to exist in reality. And then underneath it, there's this kind of thing that when they come together, we have creation, right? And you can go down the entire chain of being this happen, and it exists in our lives in a very literal way that I don't think I can say on YouTube. But one thing is going, you get it. So we understand there's this chain of creation that constantly exists. And the divine feminine is that receiving principle, right? That's what it is on its most abstract level. Now, when we look at gods and goddesses, we understand there are gods and there are goddesses, and they represent these principles. And so when we look at the divine feminine and how it interfaces in our lives, we can see that abstract principle as like the core of it, but we then look at the goddesses, right? Because that's kind of the next stage on this chain of being. And those goddesses represent all of the archetypes and manifestations of the divine feminine that exist, right? We understand that when we look at the goddess, we look at goddesses, that they rule over very different things, right? There is not one singular epithet ascribed to the goddess, right? There are goddesses like Kali, like Hecate, like Rhea, like Demeter, like all of these things, and they represent very different epithets. And all of these epithets, when we start going further down the chain of being, we see it in our material lives. I'm saying "are" for women. I know a lot of my viewers are not women, but for you, that would be the different types of gods, right? We think Pan, Hephaestus, Mars, Jupiter, Sol, Apollo, right? All of that is then going to exist in your sort of metaphysical archetypes that you pull from, right? That exist within you. So let's think about that. There's not one singular existence of the divine feminine. And when you go as a woman on your quote unquote divine feminine journey, which is what a lot of these posts are interested in, is this sort of awakening and this journey and this initiatory process of divine feminine, we're talking about a cycle that is best embodied by the idea of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, right? The maiden is the beginning of your life, right? When you are growing, when you are learning about womanhood, when you are having your first menstrual cycle, right? When you're growing up. And then once you have a child or you adopt a child or you sort of take on that village role, because obviously not everyone becomes like a literal mother, but you take on the mother archetype, right? And then as you age, you eventually become the crone, which some people don't like the word crone. There have been some critiques of it as it sounds kind of derogatory to some people. Some people really would prefer like wise woman, but it's the same thing. Crone is not meant to be like an offensive term. And as a man, if you're one of my male viewers, you undergo a very similar process with these three phases. It just would be called something different, right? It's your journey, your evolution. And so what has the divine feminine started to mean online, and why am I mad about it? So basically what has happened is a process that I'm going to call secularization. And that is taking these metaphysical ideas that intrinsically are tied to religion, belief, gods, right? These things cannot exist in a secular framework. They're not atheistic ideas. Now, one way you could kind of do that, and concepts that do this that are divine feminine based, I have less of an issue with, is through the idea of like archetypes or Jungian psychology. But even when we're looking at archetypes in Jungian psychology, there's still like a strong metaphysical influence on those things, right? They're not just in isolation, like, yeah, we're using psychology and we're not thinking in terms of like gods exactly, we're thinking about different archetypes. It still has a metaphysical root to it. And so I actually don't take huge issue with people talking about like divine feminine archetypes. Like I know there's a big quiz, like a personality test that goes around that's like, what divine feminine archetype are you? And it's like the lover, the mother, I don't remember the rest of them. There's like 9 archetypes or something. And that test I actually like. Like when I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, well that's kind of getting the point. Like, yeah, it is a little secularized, but there's still something there that clearly comes from these ideas. And so I don't really have a problem with it. But what I do have a problem with is the divine feminine being turned into meaning femininity, right? Because I think in general, our idea of femininity does not make sense. Because femininity needs to come from the divine feminine and the epithets of the goddess. It needs to be from the goddess. If it is not from the goddess, where is it from? And this is where we get to like gender stereotypes, right? Like we say femininity is like wearing pink in a dress, right? Obviously, divine feminine is a lot more than that. even the archetypes that are most similar to that, right, like that softer, nurturing side of the divine feminine, there's still more to that than wearing pink and wearing a dress. And I think it's kind of blasphemous to imply they are the same thing. Like, femininity is kind of a changing goalpost because what women wear, right? I think fashion's a good thing to look at that. That's going to change, right? Someone wearing like athleisure in public, like, wouldn't have been a thing 50 years ago. And I mean, the role of women within this idea of femininity has shifted a lot. There's been a lot of breakdown of women's place in society. And so there's a lot going on with just making the divine feminine equal femininity, which in our postmodern culture is kind of a changing goalpost that I don't like, because we're ignoring where things come from and their roots and the sort of history and tradition of what the divine feminine was. And so then it's just an ever-changing idea and it lacks a real meaning, right? It becomes a meaningless term. And something I see consistently is when things go through the secularization process that are metaphysical ideas, they really do lose meaning incredibly consistently. So we start with a metaphysical idea rooted in a pagan religion, or maybe Kabbalah or Renaissance magic, or any of these things, like rooted in metaphysical stuff. And then what'll happen is the love and light, new age, fluffy bunny crowd gets a hold of it, right? These are the people who are spiritual in nature. They often call themselves spiritual, but not religious, but they're not serious occult practitioners, right? They're like your yoga moms, your crystal girls, these people, right? These people will get their hands on a topic, a concept, and they'll simplify it down and water it down. And then it'll enter into the mainstream cultural strata, because people like us who are sitting around talking about Thelema and stuff, we're not the mainstream, and we won't ever be. We got kind of close in 2020, but even then it was still being watered down, because the reality is most people don't want to sit around learning about metaphysics. Most people don't care that much. And if we were to ever become the mainstream, if paganism were to ever take back control, there are gonna be people who are these watered down people, right? Think about Christianity, which is the current or former dominant religion in the West. So now I would probably argue atheism has beaten out Christianity for control over the Western consciousness. But, you know, there are the Creasters. People go to church on Christmas and Easter. Like, this is going to exist in every religion that becomes mainstream and every spiritual concept that becomes mainstream, which does kind of open up a conversation about if certain metaphysical ideas should be reserved for people who are serious mystics or kind of in a spiritual elite class or something. Like, there's a lot of conversations you can have about that. And if that's good or bad, but that's the way of the world. That's how things work. Once something enters the mainstream, it gets watered down. And then what happens after that is so interesting, because this doesn't happen to everything, but this has happened to the divine feminine, where it will literally be stripped of all metaphysical meaning. It'll stop even being like a new age thing, and it'll just be like a consciousness thing, like something that people just see. And so that's where we're getting this weird stuff with the divine feminine and divine feminine awakenings that has kind of gone in two very different directions. Like, and that's why this conversation is so strange to me, because when I think about divine feminine awakenings and femininity coaches and all this stuff, like, there's two completely divergent paths that this has gone down to, where even when someone is like a normie and they talk to me of the divine feminine, I don't know which of these two things they're talking about. Like, what do you mean? And so I'm going to start with the first one that I think people see more, but the second one happens enough that I do need to discuss that too. And the first one is the divine feminine as the soft life. So basically what this is it hinges on the statement, in line with your divine feminine, or I'm tapped into my divine feminine, or I'm with my divine feminine, right? And often what this means is taking yourself out of a masculine role and putting yourself into a feminine role. Often this comes from a place of burnout or trauma. People across the gender line are living in a way that is counter to how humans are meant to live and have lived historically, right? And so what happens is people are taking that dissatisfaction, that alienation, and saying, well, I'm going to reject this masculine life and embrace my divine feminine and live in my soft life. And this, even within this camp, diverges in two ways. And the first way is into this kind of like aestheticized trad thing, where it's like, you know, you live this very trad, neo-trad thing. This very like housewifey 50s thing, or like being a stay-at-home girlfriend. Like, I think a lot of the stay-at-home girlfriend stuff gets lumped into this. And the problem with this is that entire structure was already an alienated breakdown from society. Like, that's not really even a traditional structure. It's a breakdown. Like, if you're going to be really trad about things, you need to go back to whole community infrastructures, which at that point there was already a lot of breakdown. So that's a little strange and not really correct. But also, like, that's one very specific archetype of femininity, and that is an archetype of femininity. There's nothing wrong with any of that, but that's just such a specific version of femininity that it's overly specific, and it misses so much about the goddess. Now, the other thing within this camp that I see is using the divine feminine to justify hypergamy. Hypergamy is trading up, dating up, and basically dating to maximize female benefit. It's very much about, like, getting the most out of the world using your feminine charms. It's very female pickup artist to me, and I think that's kind of toxic and weird and not really how you should view human relations. It's very internet brained. So that's being called the divine feminine. And at that point, I don't even know what archetype you're pulling from. I guess like the siren. I mean, the siren is a divine feminine archetype. So I guess there's something there, but it's just very strange. Yeah. Okay. Now, the other camp, and this is camp number 2, is the divine feminine awakening as a sort of female rage thing. Like, it's a lot of like, I'm in my divine feminine and I'm screaming in the woods, right? And, connect to your rage. Sure, I've screamed in the woods. It's a good time, but that's not the wholeness of the divine feminine, and that's not a divine feminine journey. Like, great, that sounds really cathartic, and honestly, like, if you devoted that to a specific epithet of, like, the feral divine feminine, like, probably would get results, but it's so specific. And I think with this camp, there's also a lack of contemplation and shadow work going on. Like, it's a lot of very damaged people who are traumatized by legitimately bad things, and instead of working to heal that trauma, which you should be doing on your divine feminine journey, one of the things that is part of the real divine feminine journey is shadow work and healing yourself and dealing with the fact that, a lot of women have had really horrible stuff happen to them, and our society is not geared for maximum female benefit. We are living in a way that is counter to how we're meant to be living, and it's just, the digital age is not great for human flourishing. Like, that's just the truth. And so that healing journey is part of it, but if you're just doing the cathartic part, you're not doing the healing, because catharsis, once again, is actually originally a metaphysical concept where you would be filled with miasma or spiritual pollution, and then you would engage with catharsis to realign with the law of the gods. And so you would have this kind of purging moment. But after the purging, you reunite with the law of the universe, the law of the gods. That is what that idea originally meant. And so with this, it's 100% catharsis, 100% purging, but none of that realignment with the law of the gods after the purging, which means that it is purging for the sake of purging. I think of a lot of people who heavily use ayahuasca as big examples of this, right? Because in ayahuasca ceremonies, right, you puke. And puking is part of the mysticism of that experience. And what that is meant to be is a big catalyst for change, a big moment of catharsis. But if instead of using those revelations to change yourself and you're just drinking ayahuasca once a week or something crazy, like, you're not actually engaging with that practice in a serious way. You are just purging to purge instead of rebuilding in any way, right? Because creation and destruction go together. If we're going to knock down the Jenga tower, you have to build the Jenga tower back up. You have to engage with all 3 parts of the cycle, which is life, death, and rebirth. If you're 100% fixating on death and not rebirth and not life, you're going to have metaphysical imbalances. And so a lot of these things, both of these categories, right? They are specific versions of the divine feminine. They are not the wholeness of the divine feminine. If you were to secularize the divine feminine, which I don't think is a good idea at all, but if you're going to do it, you need to marry these 2 things. Because the divine feminine is the mama bear, right? It is loving the cub, but it is also, oh my God, there's a hiker near my cub, I'm going to maul his face out to protect someone, right? The divine feminine is many things. It is multifaceted. And if you strip this down to one singular idea, you're going to have an unhealthy life, and you're going to be unbalanced, and you're going to be confused, because we are not meant to live in one singular emotion and epithet all the time. That's not realistic. That's not the human experience. And that's not the divine experience, right? The divine is not all love and light and hugs and kisses, but it is also not all destruction and malice and breakdown, right? It is both of these things, and to miss that is to miss the pagan worldview, and you cannot understand the divine feminine without the pagan worldview, because at the end of the day, the divine feminine is about the goddess. Whether you like it or not, it is about the goddess. It is about these feminine spirits. Where do you think feminine energy in your feminine energy is coming to. It's a metaphysical claim, and it has to come from the goddess. It is intrinsic to the goddess, or you're missing the whole point. And so next time you see a divine feminine post or a divine feminine coach, think about what these concepts actually mean, because of course you can extrapolate lifestyle advice from these ideas. And I think that's great. I think your lifestyle and your choices should be informed by metaphysics. But if you're using metaphysical jargon to just inform your pickup artist advice, that's not that. That's not living in accordance with the gods, and that's not being in your feminine energy or whatever. Okay, that's all I have to say for this one. I hope this is helpful. If you want to support me, I'm supported through Patreon. So on the Patreon, you get an extra video every month, a ritual guide every month, and a bonus video every month. And if you're a high enough tier, you can meet with me once a month, and we can do like a kind of mentorship type process. As well, I'm hosting a group trip to India through TrovaTrip, so that's all the information for that's below. It's really exciting. I still have some slots left, so come on a vacation with me. It's really cool, and it's great to meet my community. I also host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast, which is on this YouTube channel, but also on most podcasting platforms. And I am also on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Threads, Substack. I think that's everywhere. I'm literally on every platform. It's all linked in the YouTube description if you want to see that. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're subscribed for 93 days, you will meet with a guardian angel, and you will not need to think about the divine feminine ever again. All right, bye.